Good afternoon. I must admit, it's a fantastic time to do what I do, to be someone working in artificial intelligence. When I started 30-odd years ago dreaming about it, it really was science fiction. But it's very much becoming science fact and becoming quite conventional. I get invited to try and explain where it's going to take us, where it is today, to lots of audience. I was invited onto the Q&A quite recently. First, a top tip: before you accept being invited onto Q&A, find out who the other guests are. Because I got invited on, the other guests were a sex therapist, a sex clown, a Canadian comedian, and a strident feminist. So it's the only time I've ever realized I've gone on stage and I'm the straight guy. But anyway, let me lay one concern to rest right at the beginning. The robots aren't going to take over anytime soon. Machines do only what we tell them to do, and that's actually normally the problem. We haven't thought carefully through. They're so bloody-minded at what they do that they do exactly what we did. And so they're not going to take over anytime too, and in fact, it's their stupidity that we should be more worried about than their smartness. But there's huge, great opportunity, and that potential we can see today. It's been estimated by PricewaterhouseCoopers that it's going to change the world's economy by more than $15 trillion in real terms, inflation-adjusted terms, by 2030. Now, most of us don't think in millions or billions, and I certainly don't think in trillions. So it's hard really to understand, well, what does that mean? How's that really going to change our lives? And the easy way to think about it is that we've just discovered a new continent. $15 trillion is almost precisely the GDP today of China and India. And so it really is going to be transformational, and it's not going to, as you saw from the statistics, it's not going to be the same everywhere. Some countries are going to benefit more than others, but Australia is very well placed to take advantage of some of these trends. I think the message of my talk is that if you want to see what the future is, you can actually, it's a lovely quote from William Gibson, you can actually already start to pick out little bits of it here. And whilst things may be only at the beginning, you can see little examples of what that future is going to be and how AI is going to be a big part of that future. So one obvious natural example is that we're going to have things like, your farms are going to be full of autonomous tractors. Actually, I think we're going to have autonomous tractors quicker than we're going to have autonomous cars. My colleagues who are actually helping to write software to build autonomous cars would love, actually, I think most of them would love to be building autonomous tractors. It's actually a far simpler problem. You don't have other people driving cars at the same time. You can see the open sky most of the time when you're on a farm, so you don't have to worry about getting a high-precision GPS signal, which you do when you're driving around the city. You're driving into underpasses and through tunnels. And the tractors are driving much slower than most of the cars. So it's actually a much easier problem to solve. So we'll actually see, and in fact today you can actually go, in the US, you can buy a John Deere tractor that will drive itself around the fields with high precision. Another example is, and you'll see some examples here in Australia, you can get autonomous drones. Now, some of my colleagues are working with hyperspectral cameras, and that's one reason why some of these technologies will be better than humans. It's because they're seeing wavelengths that we don't see on, and that you can see things about how the plants are growing at those wavelengths that humans possibly can't see. And it's not restricted to just flying at drone height. Increasingly, we're seeing a space race. The commercial sector is moving into the space race, and satellite imagery is going to become much more affordable. High-altitude imagery is going to be much more affordable. So you can start to survey land and do that again. AI is going to be part of that component, which is because you'll be able to actually analyze those images at speed and scale and accuracy that humans possibly can't do. Another technology that's coming along to help AI is, of course, the Internet of Things. And you can see some examples in the foyer here of some of the sensors that you're going to be able to buy at modest costs. They're going to be able to tell you things about what's going on in your fields, how much moisture there is, how the crops are growing. And of course, what is driving all of this is data. The fact that we now start to be able to collect that data, and AI is about processing that data, processing it on a scale that humans don't work at, so that we can actually do much better, not use as much water, not have to use as much fertilizer to actually grow the same amount or even more crop than you used to do. Another example, I think one that will actually come quite quickly as well, is before we even have autonomous tractors, is things like precision weeding. So here's an image of some computer vision, an algorithm that's been trained to recognize weeds and plants. The plants that are in green, the weeds are in red, and now you can actually, on your tractor, you can actually precision spray with the herbicide just the weeds, use less herbicide. That saves you money, but also saves the planet. Again, that's being enabled by some of these technologies. Another very good example, this is an Australian company, Go Micro. They started developing a microscope that you could clip on to your smartphone. And then they thought of, well, what else could they do with this? They were selling it into schools, and they thought, well, maybe we could help farmers identify pests. And it's a good example of how the technology is democratizing what we can do. So they actually just went and got the TensorFlow library that Google give out for free, and they trained it on fruit flies. So it can recognize, you can give this to a farmer, and you can recognize exactly what pest is infecting your crop and what you might need to do with that particular pest. Another example, face recognition. You may have seen face recognition being used for people. Well, you can use it for pigs. And in fact, in China, it is being used for pigs. Interesting aside here, they actually took some software that was trained to recognize human faces. And interesting enough, it didn't take much to adjust it to recognize pig faces. And the idea, I'm not sure how useful this idea is, that, well, instead of having to put a tag on the pig's ear, you could just recognize them by their faces, and so you can see whether they're feeding, you could look at their welfare. I'm not sure that necessarily this is the best solution to this problem. I mean, we could just put an RFID tag on their ears. But at any rate, the whole point is that if you collect more data, if you can track your pigs, if you can find out which ones are feeding properly or which ones are behaving in a healthy way, then you can do much better with your farm. Another example, some of my colleagues at QUT are actually building robot arms that can pick capsicums and other types of fruit. Now, before you get too excited and think, oh, well, this is going to solve all my labor problems, this is a really hard problem. And it's one of the ironies that we call it Moravec's paradox, that the easy things for us, just reaching up and picking a fruit, something that we can do without almost thinking, is actually really hard for a robot to do. Millions of years of evolution have taught us how to do these things, and it's a difficult, painful thing to get a machine to do that with precision, especially out in the wild. And the hard things, ironically the opposite, the hard things for us, playing chess, things like that, are actually quite easy to get computers to do. As a really good example of this is a towel folding robot. So some of my colleagues at the University of California in Berkeley have built this robot to fold towels. It takes 25 minutes to fold a towel. So unfortunately, some of those things, robots in the household, are still going to take us quite a while before we get there. There's one area I think that we're going to see a lot of AI in very quickly, and actually on Tuesday there was a big announcement from the government. They're setting up a new cooperative research center in Future Foods. I'm very excited about this. One of my friends, another professor at UNSW, actually was leading the bid behind this. It's bringing in a huge, great consortia of people from Farmers New South Wales, many of the universities, and many companies throughout the food chain to look at actually where AI and robotics is perhaps going to have one of the most immediate impacts, which is indoor farming. They're setting up 7 centers, 7 food hubs. The one in New South Wales is going to be just out by Badgers Creek. They're going to be closely connected to transport hubs, to airports, so that you can fly the produce to China, where they're going to obviously pay top dollar for that. I'm not sure whether that's environmentally very sound, but at any rate, that's how, with these sorts of technologies, we can meet these goals of growing the food industry from being a $50 billion contribution to our GDP to what is estimated by 2030 to be, which is a $100 billion contributor to our GDP. And because we're looking here at indoor farming, you can be really in control of the environment. I mean, the challenge for people like myself to get our robots, to get our AI working out in the field is the uncertainty of everything that's happening in the real world. If we can control the environment, we can control the temperature, we can control the lighting, we can control the water, it's so much easier to collect the data, to be in control of everything in these indoor farms. And there's huge, great potential to be growing really high-quality produce close to where it's needed. So that's the other thing. I mean, that's the other area. I've talked a lot about examples of how we're going to transform the production of food, but it's throughout the food chain that you can expect to see AI contributing. And in fact, most of my personal work has been on these sorts of areas, in areas like logistics. We've worked with some very big, fast-moving consumer good companies that spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year on transport. And we reckon in most of those businesses, if we can go in, if they haven't already used some AI to optimize what they do, how they route the trucks, they do it in a smart way, that we can save them 10% of their fuel bill. That's a fantastic bottom line saving to these businesses. One company that was spending a couple of $100 million a year, that was $40 million a year. Recurrent savings, which was actually about what their profit margin was that year. It's the only gig I've worked on where the CEO said, do whatever those geeks tell you to do, which is a fantastic job to be working on. But it makes a really, not only an important difference to the bottom line of those businesses, but it makes a really important difference to the planet. Because not only is that 10% less fuel that they're spending money on, that means it's 10% less CO2. That's thousands of tons of CO2 that we're not having to put up in the atmosphere, delivering the same amount of goods that much more efficiently. Now, of course, when you start making these sorts of predictions, people get very worried, very nervous. Well, are they going to come for my job? And it's a really important conversation that we should be having, but one where there's a huge disconnect between reality and what's really going to happen. I've looked very closely at some of the predictions, and some of the predictions are just way off, that many things are going to be much more challenging to get machines to do than people expect. And as one example, one of the predictions that was by 2030, there's a 75% chance that agricultural mechanics are going to be replaced. Now, I can tell you, any of you guys, any of the audience who happen to be tinkering away in your shed recently will know these are difficult, fiddly jobs. We're not going to get robots doing those anytime soon. And then when we do, they're going to be really expensive robots. We're not going to replace not people who aren't that well paid by very expensive robots. So there's lots of jobs that won't be replaced. There is going to be huge amounts of disruption, and there will be lots of jobs that will go. And that's a really important conversation that we need to have. We need to think very carefully about how we support people through these changes. What are the important skills, the people skills, the creativity, the emotional intelligence, the social intelligence, things that machines don't do well today and are unlikely to do well anytime in the future, and even when they do well, we'll just prefer interacting with humans. These are the really important conversations about the way that work is going to change in the future. And it's happening today. We cannot put our head in the sand and say, oh, these things are way off. This is still science fiction, Toby. It's not science fiction. You can see, as I said, the grassroots of this happening today. You can see examples of these technologies, and they're going to arrive very, very quickly. And as one example, one of the major Australian banks announced last year not only record profits, but also that they were going to lay off 6,000 staff because 6,000 of them were needed, and they were going to hire 2,000 people with the right digital skills. Because, you know, data is starting to eat our world, how do we support people through these changes? These are the really important conversations that we need to have, to think carefully about, you know, what is the work of the future going to be? And it's going to be very different to the work of the past. And you only have to think back in your own lifetime. Back, you know, when you started work, how different work looked then. If you went into most jobs 50 years ago, it was a very different world than the world we see today. And in 50 years' time, less than 50 years' time, work again will look very different. If you do want to know, I'd encourage you to take a look at my latest book, which, as was mentioned in the introduction, is entitled 2062. The good reason, I'll explain 2 reasons why it's called 2062. The first reason is because I surveyed 300 of my colleagues, and that's when they estimated machines would eventually be as smart as us. Now, I should say, there was a huge, great distribution of answers, huge, great uncertainty. We still only build machines that can do one narrow, focused task. There's still nothing that matches the breadth of ability that all of you have, your emotional intelligence, your social, all of those things that make us human. So we've still got a huge way to go to build machines that match us. But we can build machines that do narrow tasks already, many of them at superhuman level. The important thing to take away, despite that uncertainty, it's not going to happen, ladies and gentlemen, on June the 3rd in 2062. It's going to happen, though. It's not going to happen in 1,000 years. It's not going to happen in 10 years. It's sometime in the next 50 or 100 years. If we're lucky, maybe it's going to be in our lifetimes. And it's almost surely going to happen in our children's lifetimes. That's the important thing to take away. We also surveyed the public, and it was interesting, the public thought it was actually much nearer, 2042. That it's actually a much more challenging problem. But it's already starting to impact our lives. And then the other reason is that 2062 turns out to be a very appropriate time frame to be thinking about the scale and how these changes, when these changes will actually arrive, is that I was trying to explain to my daughter what the book was about. And I said, well, it's the world you're going to inherit. And then I did the maths. And in 2062, she will be exactly my age. So it's very much, 2062 is the world our children will be inherit, the world of artificial intelligence. Thank you very much.